Hello, I'm Steve Wolf, President of the Beyond Earth Institute. Welcome to today's program on Becoming Off-Worldly, a conversation with author Laura Forczyk and commercial spaceflight providers. Before introducing our guest panel, first, a few announcements about upcoming Beyond Earth activities. For those of you who are not aware, Beyond Earth is a think tank whose mission is to develop the legal and policy framework that will enable economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. It seems that every day there's a new article in the mainstream media that is critical or even dismissive about the vision for human expansion into space as articulated by Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others. And just yesterday, again, the Washington Post article called Musk's space settlement aspirations a sci-fi fantasy. Now, we could become despondent in the face of these public criticism of our vision of humankind's future in space. Or we can recognize that this public attention is simply proof that this vision that we have been striving for many decades is really starting to become a reality, and indeed it is. This backlash to our vision was bound to come. And now that it's here, we must accept it and then persevere through it. To advance this discussion on our terms, Beyond Earth has two exciting in-person events that are coming up that I want to tell you about, and I hope that you'll participate. First, the Beyond Earth will be chairing the policy track at the National Space Society's International Space Development Conference in Arlington, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. next month on May 27th. ISDC is an excellent conference, especially for advocates. I encourage you to attend that conference, attend the track, and I think there's even a day pass if you want to just come on that Friday. So I hope to see you there. Next, I'm extremely pleased to announce that the Beyond Earth has locked in a date and a location for our inaugural annual symposium to be held at the University of Arizona's DC Center on October 13th in Washington, D.C. We are very fortunate to have a Beyond Earth advisor and NASA legend Pete Worden as our honorary chair for this event. And here's a photo. Let's see. Yeah, that's Pete Worden there. I think most people on this call would know very much who he is. Next is a photo of at the University of Arizona facilities, myself and then Courtney Stad, who has a long history with NASA, Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, has been a leader in commercial space over these many decades. He is a close partner of ours. This event will be an invitation only, in person, and will be broadcast live to anyone wishing to participate. If anyone is interested in becoming involved in this event, in the project and planning and so forth, and interested in speaking, all of the above, sponsoring of course, please be in touch with me and we'll be reaching out to the community as well. Okay, so now for today's program, which I'm particularly excited about, which is a bit of a departure from our usual discussion. Laura will lead this discussion on how each of us can prepare for our own journey into space, whether that's as a professional astronaut or as a bucket list space tourist, which I'm probably in that category. One day I intend to go to space, and I'm very glad that I read her book. Laura is the owner of the space consulting firm Astrolytical, which specializes in space science, industry, policy, and offering space career coaching services. She's also Beyond Earth's Vice President for Research and Analytics. She serves as a mentor for the Brooke Owens Fellowship Program and has authored 2 books, Becoming Off-Worldly, which we'll be discussing today, as well as her first book, The Rise of the Space Age Millennials. Laura's book, Becoming Off-Worldly, has been very well received since it came out just a few months ago. It was #1 on Amazon in its category, and it has a perfect 5-star ratings there. Reviews have been extremely favorable, and personally, I found it to be a wonderful look into the authentic, everyday experience of living and working in space. Laura will hi Laura, how are you? Thank you so
Hi.
much again for being here. I'll let you introduce your panel and get the conversation underway. Laura will be taking questions, so please use the chat field that you have on whatever platform you're using, and she'll answer, her and the panel will answer as many questions as she can. So Laura, the program's yours.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you for organizing this and providing a platform for us to speak about becoming off-worldly, which is available now. You can go to astronautical.com and order it, or you could go to Amazon, available on ebook or paperback, and I am recording an audiobook eventually. And I wanted to thank everyone who was involved in that. The subtitle of the book is Learning from Astronauts to Prepare for Your Spaceflight Journey. And that actually means that I interviewed quite a number of astronauts for this book, as well as future flyers. And one person, the only person that I interviewed for the book who is not a flown astronaut or a future flyer with ticket in hand, at least, as far as I know, Tom Shelley. He is part of our panel today. He is the president of Space Adventures. Space Adventures is the only organization to have organized trips for private astronauts to go to the International Space Station with partnering Roscosmos, at least in the past, historically. And they have been in existence since 1998. And Tom has been president since, for the past, I think it's been since the past 12 years. And before that, he was the vice president of marketing and sales for Space Adventures. So they have had, 9 missions to the International Space Station, the most recent one in December with 2 individuals. Prior to that, in the 2000s, they flew 8 missions with 7 individuals, 2 of which I also interviewed for my book. And I'm really looking forward to hearing how Tom plans to take International Space Station tourism, if you want to call it that. I personally call it private astronauts, human spaceflight, commercial human spaceflight, how you want to see that in the future. And then I also have the privilege of interviewing Nicholas Patrick for my book. Now, Nick has flown to space twice with NASA, back in 2006 on Discovery STS-116, and then also on STS-130 Endeavour in 2010, one of those last missions. Since the space shuttle was retired, Nick has also retired from NASA and gone on to Blue Origin since 2012. He has been the flight director for New Shepard and also the senior director of human integration for Blue Origin. So really awesome that he can take his human spaceflight experience that he personally felt over 2 missions and tie that into his experience with Blue Origin's recent flights, which now they've had. We're up to NS-20, but how many of those have been human? Is it 3 or 4? 4, right? I've lost track. That's how many have been going on since July. Really excited to hear more from both Tom and Nick. So thank you both for being here.
You're welcome. It's great to be here. Thank you, Laura.
Nice to be here.
One of the things that I wanted to kick off, and I apologize, I didn't include this in my initial questions that I sent to you, but one of those things that I asked all the astronauts who have flown in space that I interviewed for my book is, what surprised you about spaceflight? And I was surprised by some of those responses, because it was the things that you commonly think about in spaceflight. It was, floating in weightlessness. It was the view from Earth. It was doing everyday things in space and how complicated that can be. And I know that Nick, you've experienced that. And Tom, you helped prepare people for those surprises. So I'd love for you both to just kick us off here with how you perceive those differences between living on Earth and living in space.
Shall I start, Laura?
Sure, go ahead.
I have to say, space was full of many surprises. It was even more beautiful, interesting, and an overwhelming experience than I expected. But my single biggest surprise, maybe a surprise to people, my single biggest surprise was that none of the surprises were really as big as you would expect, because the training we had at NASA was so good. We'd been in simulators that tipped us on our backs and shook us just like launch on the shuttle. We had wonderful debriefs from astronauts who'd flown before us on everything from the big picture of spaceflight to the details of self-care. and how to take pictures in space and things like that. So my biggest surprise after I thought about it for a while was that there were no really big surprises. I'd grown up with Apollo photographs. I'd had great training. And at Blue Origin, we're trying to make sure that the folks who fly with us have that kind of great training as well, so that they are not overwhelmed by spaceflight, but can fully appreciate it.
Yeah, and I haven't been, so I can't comment. But having spoken with our clients, this is a question that comes up quite a lot. So I have spoken with a number of them about it, and it's very similar to what Nick says. The surprise is just how close the training is to launch. And I remember Richard Garriott and a couple others saying almost word for word what Nick said, that the launch was so similar in feeling and sensation to what they'd been through during the training, that it was like just going through another training activity. And they were so comfortable. They didn't feel themselves getting anxious or concerned, that they were able to really relax and enjoy the experience for what it was, because they felt so well prepared for it. But I will add a little bit to what Nick said. And universally, they've all said experiencing being in space, that weightlessness and the view, no matter how much you think about it ahead of time and think that you're going to respond to it, the surprise comes in your actual reaction. That what you think may be absolutely wonderful turns out maybe not to be quite so wonderful, and what you're expecting to be less impactful is actually more impactful. So it's that I think the difference between the anticipation and the reality can often bring up a lot of surprises too.
Yes, that is a very common theme in my book, and I'm really glad that you brought it up, the difference between expectation and reality, and how the little things can pop at you differently. And the big things as well, that view from Earth universally was, I think that's the longest chapter in my book, is all of the people who said that it just shocked them in various ways about how Earth looked from above. Tom, I think a question that everyone has on their mind right now, I know I certainly do, what's the future of space adventures in light of the recent events in Russia?
Well, if I got $1 for every time I got asked that question at the moment, we wouldn't have an issue whatsoever. So, yes, space adventures, we've partnered with Roscosmos for over 20 years. We've arranged space flights now for, as you point out, I think 9 private individuals originating 6 different countries. And, we, along with our clients, have become very familiar with and appreciate Russian culture, and we've made, long-lasting friendships. So we're pretty distraught at the moment over the crisis situation in Ukraine. We don't think it's reflective of a lot of our experiences in Russia and with the Russians that we've got to know. And until peace is restored, we've suspended the advancement of any future spaceflight opportunities with Roscosmos. And so now we're assessing our options with our US-based partners, and that's about as much as I can say at this point. And we'll share more as more concrete arrangements are made.
Of course, yes. I don't want to make light of any kind of situation where we've got humans dying on the ground. So I know that is primarily what the concern is, and we don't want to exasperate any kind of situation there between what's going on with conflict. So talking about the future, though, I want to know where you guys think in the farther future. Maybe not what's going on right now on the Earth, but where do you see commercial spaceflight evolving over the next decade or so?
If I may, I think, our motto at Blue is that we want to see millions of people living and working in space, and that's definitely in our future. Maybe not this year or this decade, but in the future, that's the kind of human presence in space that we're all working towards. And on top of that, I think we all of the companies involved in commercial spaceflight want to make access to space easier, so that you don't need to be a professionally trained astronaut as I was, as most of the people who've flown to space have been. But you can be somebody who treats flying into space more the way a business traveler treats the flight to Europe or the far coast of the US. You don't put a lot of effort into that flight. You put your effort into the task you have to do when you get to your destination. And that's, to me, the power of commercial spaceflight, is bringing down the cost and simplifying access to space so that everybody can get on with the business of doing the things in space that will make space valuable to those of us on Earth.
Thank you. I'm going to
Mhm.
go ahead and ask you again, though, where do you see we're going in the next decade? So can you talk at all about, New Glenn, Orbital Reef, even the future of New Shepard?
We'll be flying New Shepard as we've been doing for the past few years. As you said, we're on our 20th flight, and we've just had our 4th flight with humans. We've flown 20 so far, and we're going to be doing more of that. We'll be flying science payloads on New Shepard as well, resuming flights with payloads. Our New Glenn rocket is a human-rated rocket from the start. And while we will initially be flying non-human payloads to low Earth orbit, ultimately we will be able to fly humans on that. And we are designing an orbital reef, a commercial space station in low Earth orbit that will be able to house private individuals, companies, NASA astronauts, all sorts of people in low Earth orbit doing research. So the intermediate future for us is interesting and bright. And the distant future, I think, will be even brighter.
We're all looking forward to millions of people living and working in space. Tom, where do you see it going? Maybe not necessarily for space adventures, since so much is uncertain right now, and we hope that there is a great future for space adventures on these commercial flights, commercial space stations. Where do you see human spaceflight in general evolving to?
Well, 2021 was the year that everybody had been waiting for, I think, within this industry. I've been around it for 15, 20 years now. And, we saw, by my count, it was more than 20 private individuals flew to space last year alone on 4 different vehicles. And that was, I think there were more individuals who flew to space privately than there were professional astronauts. So it was pretty much a banner year for this industry. And those vehicles, they're ramping up operations. We still have Starliner to come online. Obviously, Starship is making great progress. So, the next decade, I think, is going to see human spaceflight, and private human spaceflight in particular, just become more and more commonplace. But I don't want to set any, misconceptions. It's taken an awful long time to get to where we are to have this wonderful year of 2021. And it's going to take an awful long time from this point until it really gets to that point where millions of people are flying. In the near term, and I would say this probably for the next decade, it really is going to remain as an activity for the financially successful. Put it that way. Ticket prices are going to remain relatively high. They're going to stay out of reach for the vast majority of of regular individuals. Now, it doesn't mean that we're not eventually going to get our opportunity, but what's important is that we continue to support this activity and support those who are financially successful in encouraging them to take this step. They are helping to rise the tide, and with it, all boats will rise, and so we'll all be better off in the long run. But we've got to keep a little bit of reality to it for the time being. It's still a very expensive endeavor, and I appreciate what Nick says about making it easier, but certainly for orbital spaceflight, it's still going to take a long time to prepare. It's still a challenge for clients, and it's still a commitment. I don't think we can't diminish that. I think suborbital, yes, you can make that a lot easier and a lot more routine because you have that regular flight rate, and the risk profile is a little bit different. I think we're going to see more investment. It's been great the last few years, and I think it's going to be interesting to see with these commercial space stations that are coming online or that are getting funding. It's like the Commercial Crew Program. That initial funding is coming from government, and it will be interesting to see just how much private investment comes in as well. We've seen some. But not a huge amount. And I think over the course of the next 3 or 4 years, we'll get a better understanding of really how much private interest there is, and really what that overall marketplace looks like, because it's the market that is going to dictate that level of investment. But what I will say is, somebody who's been out selling private space flight for 15 years is overall awareness has changed. I'm no longer speaking to prospects and explaining to them that this is something that you can do, that it's possible, that they may not have been aware of before. We've reached a level of awareness generally in the marketplace that private spaceflight is sort of part of the common narrative. It's being talked about amongst friends and families and at dinner parties and what have you. And so it's no longer this, my God, you're kidding me, I could really do something like that. And I think that helps in the long-term development of the marketplace. Once you get to that level of awareness, now you're starting to compare experiences, you're comparing prices, you're getting into the level of detail of one vehicle compared to another. And I think that really helps. And people are starting to put this on their bucket list, not just as a maybe one day, if technology is good enough, then I'll get to do this. It's actually, you know what, I can plan for this, 5 years time, 10 years time. I think the time's going to be right for me to do it. And that's big.
Thank you. That is awesome. Nick, do you see that same narrative change?
I do. I think, I really do. We see people now talking about spaceflight as though it will be accessible to many, many more people within their lifetimes. The price is high right now. But at Blue Origin, we're taking the ticket prices and we're rolling it right back into the improvement of our vehicle and the efforts we have to make it less expensive to fly, so that we really will get to the point where many, many more people can fly in space, and the commercial opportunities will improve as well as the cost comes down. I think orbital spaceflight will always take more training than suborbital spaceflight. We have suborbital spaceflight down to not about a day and a half of training now, which is wonderful. People come in, they learn the capsule, they learn what the experience will be like. That's part of our effort to, I would say, acclimatize them to spaceflight so that they can fully appreciate the experience. And they learn the few emergency procedures we have crew potentially involved in, and then they're ready to fly. And that training, you never want the training to go to zero anyway. I can tell you that the training is one of the things that gives you some of the best memories you'll have about spaceflight. Mm-hmm. But orbital spaceflight, it took me years to get ready. Ultimately, it will take people weeks to get ready, I believe, for a tour on a space station like the Orbital Reef. And the training will ultimately center not on the space flight itself, but on the things they plan to do when they get to low Earth orbit or high Earth orbit or the moon or Mars. And that's what we want. We want the space flight to be an exciting, interesting, life-changing experience, but not at all a barrier to getting into space. And we're well on the way to achieving that, I think.
That is beautiful. And that leads nicely into my next question. And I know that 4 people that I interviewed for my book who were future flyers is what I called them, not to get away from the controversy of what's an astronaut, although I did call them private astronauts. They flew into space. So I interviewed 14 people who were future flyers, and already 4 of them flew. That just tells me how quickly this is moving. And in fact, this latest Blue Origin flight had 2 of my colleagues on board. And I was really, the more people I know personally that go up in space, the more it just seems so realistic. I was honored to go see Michael Lopez Alegria fly again, an extended stay right now up there with Axiom. And so the more people that you and I know, I mean, it's your jobs to know, but the more people in the audience, let's say, who can connect with those people who are getting those tickets, who are flying in space, the more they feel that it's realistic for them. And then they can have those experiences that you were just talking about, Nick, such as the overview effect. And that is a question I wanted to dive into. So those of you not familiar with the term, Frank White, who is an author who wrote the book, The Overview Effect, also the forward for my book. So thank you again, Frank. He describes this change, this cognitive change of how you see the world, how you see the interconnectedness of humanity, how you see the environmental systems of the planet, just how you see things change just based on your view from above. And above being, on an airplane like Frank when he got that term coined, or up in space. And I would love to know your perceptions on who is most likely to experience some kind of version of the overview effect. And it is different for everyone. And whether it matters, whether it's suborbital or orbital. I did not get a chance to interview William Shatner after his flight, but I did include his remarks. And I was shocked at that only 4 minutes of space flight over a Blue Origin flight. And he suborbitally, and he had this whole mind blown, 90 years of age. And he came back down to Earth after just a short space flight. And he had a complete different way of viewing things. So I want to get your perspectives, Tom, based on the people that you have seen fly in space or people that you have spoken with who, have this perception of how they might see the world differently once they go up. And then Nick, how you have experienced it yourself, and also how you've heard from other Blue Origin clients who might have experienced some kind of cognitive shift themselves.
Can I defer to Nick? I feel far less qualified to speak about this than him. I haven't been. So I do have thoughts on it, but I'd like to hear Nick's thoughts first, as probably the more qualified of the two of us.
Sure, thank you, Tom. The term I like is the astronaut perspective, and it's flying in space is an experience that changes everybody, and sometimes the changes are dramatic, and sometimes they are more amplifications of the things you thought about before you flew. In my case, I always thought environmental issues were really critical, that we should be paying a lot more attention to the environment than we were, and probably the biggest change in my perspective during my 2 space flights was that I saw the Earth not just as the traditional closed system that environmentalists and scientists tell us it is. I saw Earth as a spaceship, a very big spaceship with 7, 8, 9 billion people on it, but a spaceship nonetheless. And one of the things you learn when you're training to fly in space is that resources, whatever they are, from time to water to oxygen to fresh clothing to food and vegetables and so on, they're very critical, and you have to really look after them carefully. Obviously, nobody leaves a window open on the space station, but you also don't throw away things. You don't fly unnecessary packaging. You don't waste water. You don't waste oxygen or electricity. They're all finite resources. And when you've had that training and then you get to space and you look down on Earth, you begin to see it as a spaceship with a lot of astronauts on it flying through the cosmos. That for me was the change. I have other friends who've come back with amplified perspectives. And as to whether amplified perspectives that they perhaps already had, if you'd asked them, but they came back with much stronger convictions about those perspectives. And there've been other people, I think it's completely changed. I wasn't one of those, I think, in part because of the great training and the fact that I grew up soaking up as much science fiction and as much of the interesting imagery and materials that the Apollo astronauts brought back as I possibly could. As for whether a suborbital spaceflight can give you the same shift in perspective, I think William Shatner, whom you mentioned, was a wonderful case study. He had, in spite of being an actor who thought about spaceflight for many years, he had, I think, very limited experience with spaceflight itself. And he was incredibly eloquent, I think, about the experience. Maybe one of the most eloquent astronauts I've listened to. And all that based on a few minutes in space. He was really moved by it. And I think if everybody could have the experience he had, doesn't need to be days or weeks in space. If everybody could have that experience, I think so many people would be equally moved. You look down on the Earth and you see it for what it is. You see the blackness of space above, the how inhospitable space is, and how beautiful the Earth is below, and it changes you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting description there. I like the astronaut perspective. I appreciate that. Thank you, Nick. So I haven't experienced this, so please take these comments with that in mind. But when you asked the question, Laura, I had to go back and I had to look up the meaning of the overview effect to make sure that I was processing this question correctly. And it seems like a pretty deep emotional response to an experience. And I've spoken with our clients who've spent multiple days on the space station, up to a couple of weeks, and some have commented on it, that same level of transformation, and others have not. So I think it's a very personal experience. But I'll be honest and say I find it difficult to see that radical shift happening in 5 minutes on a suborbital flight. Because it sounds too profound, and I don't know if you can develop a full appreciation of what you're looking at in such a short period of time. It sounds a little bit to me like, well, I visited a Buddhist temple once and now I found inner peace. I think it's a little more complicated, a little more complex transformation than that. Now, having said that, I think it's very important that for the sector as a whole and for what we're trying to do in advancing and promoting private space flight is anybody's perspective is valuable. And if they've seen Earth and feel as though they're impacted by it, and they're prepared to communicate it and talk about it, then I think that's wonderful. And the more people who have that experience and shout about it, the better. So, whether you go in with a preconceived notion that you're going to get it, or whether it happens even though you weren't expecting it to, I don't think it matters whatsoever. I think what's important is that people share, genuinely share, how they were impacted by the experience in the way that Mr. Shatner's done, and hopefully more people like him. And Nick, you've probably heard this comment before. A huge proportion of the number of astronauts who've flown, they're professionals, and you guys are qualified and girls are qualified in ways that I certainly am not, with science and technical and engineering backgrounds, but not necessarily as communicators. And I think that's what some of the private astronauts can really bring to the table, is an ability to talk about what it means to be in space and to communicate that experience in a very, very different way. If you look at MZ's mission, Yusaku Maezawa, who flew with us back in December, if you've watched any of his YouTube videos, he communicates and talks about the experience in an entirely different way than anything that you'd see coming out of the professional space agencies. And even I haven't seen it communicated and talked about in the same way from the guys who are up there at the moment with Axiom. So it's a very personal thing, and the private astronauts really do have an awful lot to bring to that conversation and that ability to communicate.
Yeah, I love the different communication styles, and I don't think there's one wrong way. And communication is vital to getting the word out, to spreading whatever it is that they felt change inside of them. And even more important, I think, is doing something about it. So I love to hear, for example, Richard Garrett, he talked about after he had that experience of, he didn't know the overview effect either, despite the fact that his father, Owen Garrett, was a NASA astronaut. And he talked about how that he took it as an environmental, takeaway, where we needed to protect our fragile planet and see how Earth, or how human activities on Earth go and change things, and how we have a responsibility, each one of us, to do something to protect our planet. We only have one planet, and we're all sharing it. And
can I jump in there, Laura? So I had the pleasure of being at dinner with Richard and Owen Garriott in London shortly after Richard's flight. And Richard had spent about 15 minutes waxing very lyrical as he can about his own personal experience and how it impacted him. And I turned to Owen and I said, "So Owen, how was your experience in space? How was your time on Skylab?" He thought about it for about 5 seconds and he said, "It was nominal." And that was it. Right? So two completely different people with two.
That's a very professional astronauts,
and they're related. It was brilliant.
That's lovely.
Yeah. That's why we need the diversity of human population to be up on in space to communicate in a diversity of ways.
100%.
A few flights ago, we had the privilege of flying the first father-son pair to fly on the same space flight. Mm-hmm. They had very different perspectives on their experience. So it's wonderful to see these things and to watch people share their experiences.
Yeah, it's the first father-son pairing, the first husband-wife pairing up there. I love the different firsts that we're seeing here. And of course, the firsts from, various countries. We still have about 3/4 of the planet who have not seen a representative go to space of their own. So, lots of people who have been left out. I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about my last chapter, which is a chapter about making sure that we make space accessible for all humanity. And that includes people with disabilities. So lots of different ways that we need to improve. And in fact, this question might be a good one to ask is, how do you both see that we need to make space more inclusive? And I'm talking about human spaceflight in particular. How do we make it more inclusive so that we can bring up more and more representatives of the human population?
I think there are two main ways to make space more inclusive. The first, I think everybody is working on, I know we are, which is reducing the cost of access to space, so that more and more and more people, and eventually, potentially, everybody who would like to go can go to space. That won't happen soon, but it will happen. And everybody in this industry, I think, has that common goal. The second thing is we need to make sure that space is ultimately accessible to people with all sorts of disabilities or challenges. People who have less than perfect vision, people with hearing challenges, people who are perhaps paraplegic, quadriplegic, missing limbs. All these things are ultimately, I believe, going to be accommodated by many, many spaceflight solutions. And we are actively working to make sure we will be able to accommodate those people in the future.
I'm glad to hear it. And I want to bring up Astro Access, which is a great organization that is currently flying people with disabilities on zero-G flights and hopefully on space flights in the future. Tom, I know, speaking of Richard Garriott, he, I think, was the first to fly with LASIK eye surgery. Have you had any experiences accommodating different disabilities or different first person to do X, first person from somewhere?
We don't look at it in that way for when it comes to health issues. But I will say as a general comment, what we have been able to do with pretty much each of our clients have flown with some type of a novel or first health issue that has required some attention and care and management. And collectively, they are lowering the bar of what it means to be able to fly to space. The government agencies are able to select the best because they're selecting from a very large pool of candidates, and they want to be able to minimize the risk that they're exposing themselves to. But you can't make those same choices and the same evaluations when when it's a private astronaut self-selecting. Some of our clients, and Richard talks very publicly about it. It wasn't just LASIK eye surgery. He'd had I think it was a kidney procedure beforehand. Charles Simone had some other health issues that again have been very well documented. And Charles in particular is very pleased. One of the things he found most rewarding from his participation was that he was showing that the bar could be lowered for participation, so that he was, paving the way for others to be able to follow on after him. And I think, again, we've had 20 plus people fly to space, in 2021 as private individuals. And I'm sure many of those have contributed in some way, shape or form to that lowering of the bar and demonstrating that some of these health concerns that maybe would have been prohibitive under a government agency protocol are not necessarily the same for private protocols.
It's often been said that NASA is as medically selective as they are because they can be, because they
absolutely
have more applicants.
Why would you not be?
Why would you not be? Right.
Yeah.
But in the commercial sector, we're taking a different approach. We are really just making sure that people can do the tasks that they need to do, a smaller set of tasks to be sure than a professional astronaut that NASA has to do on, for example, a shuttle or station flight. But making sure that they're capable of doing them. For a suborbital flight, it's really that simple. And I think one of the ways in which we're expanding access to space is by increasing the age bounds. Traditionally, astronauts have been in their 30s, 40s, maybe 50s. In recent flights, we have flown both the youngest and the oldest people to ever fly in space. Suborbital flight, admittedly not orbital flight yet. But we've flown an 18-year-old and a 90-year-old. And I don't think there's really any limit to how far those age boundaries can be pushed, as long as a person can do the things they need to do to safely fly. And that's a very exciting aspect of opening up access to space to more and more people.
Yeah, it's a question that I'm asked a lot. Is there an age limit? And the answer is always the same. No, there's a health limit, but there's no age limit.
And we will make we'll shrink the health limit. Sorry, we'll
absolutely, yeah. Expand that envelope. Yeah.
So that there are fewer and fewer things that disqualify people from flying in space.
Mm-hmm.
I had the honor of interviewing Wally Funk before and after her flight. She was the second oldest now to fly in space, oldest at the time. And she's just a trip. I'm so glad I got to see her fly. And then I also had the honor of interviewing Haley Arsenault, who was the first person to publicly fly to space with a prosthesis, which, again, anybody who's ever seen her or seen an interview of her, she just raises all the spirits as we lower the bar to who can fly. And I'm just so glad to see more and more people who are being public about the fact that they're not the right stuff kind of astronaut, that we can get more and more types of people up there. What kind of advice would you both give to private astronauts who want to fly to space, future astronaut hopefuls, let's call them?
Should I go first on this one?
Sure.
So what advice would I give? I'd say don't wait, be part of the revolution. You're an astronaut not just for the days or the minutes that you're in space, but you're an astronaut for the rest of your life. So why wait, right? It's an experience that you get to share. And if you like Richard Garriott, you share a lot, which is, tremendous. It's a story that you always have to tell. And it's a story that lots of people want to hear. So, you and as Anusha says, you have to be the change that you want to see in the world, right? So if you believe in the future of humanity being able to exist, be a multiplanetary species, and you want to see space and space travel advance, then you've got to step up now and be part of it. Don't wait for others to do it. If everybody waits, then nothing happens. So the other thing, once you've committed to it being something that you want to do, you got to be patient, because it's hard, particularly orbital spaceflight. The preparation, the commitment, the risks, there's high degrees of uncertainty. There's a lot of change. Look at what the AX-1 crew went through. Their flight date got pushed. I lost count of the number of times. There's high degrees of uncertainty. Okay, they've got extra days on the end, but again, they weren't planning for that. Again, you've got to be flexible. And so, pack your patience. It really is, it's a long game that you're in for. And the last thing is prepare. Use your time in space well, right? It's a very, very precious commodity, and making sure that you use that time effectively. Whether it's just for your own personal satisfaction of making sure you plan some time when you can just sit and be and relax and look out the window or listen to music or whatever it is that you want to do that you feel is going to help you take something emotionally out of the flight, prepare for it. If it's a whole suite of educational programs or research projects, just put that time and effort in beforehand, because it's such a precious commodity to have. So that's what I would say.
Well, I agree with all of Tom's comments, and patience particularly is a virtue in spaceflight, either because the thing you would like to do, perhaps go to the moon as a private astronaut, isn't yet available. It will be one day, trust me, one day soon, or because the launch schedule slips. Everybody who's launched into space has had a scrub. I've had two, and there's a character building experiences that require a little patience. What I would encourage people to think of if they're interested in going to space is, as Tom says, don't wait, do it, absolutely. But remember that however difficult, however expensive it currently is, everybody who flies in space is part of a great adventure. They are expanding human experience. They're preparing space in some way for all those who come after them. So whatever it is you plan to do in space, a short suborbital flight, an intermediate orbital flight, or one day a long trip to the moon or Mars, you are part of humanity's great expansion into space. And that is just a wonderful thing to contribute your time, energy, and resources to. So yeah, sign up as soon as you can, fly in space, and become part of this great new space race.
Thank you both. That was beautiful. And that is the reason I wrote my book, is because I really wanted to give a guide of, what it is that people need to practically do to prepare themselves, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, in any possible way, whether or not they have a flight date or whether it's a dream still. And so if you're interested, please purchase the book. And also Becoming Off-Worldly Together is a community that I just started, becomingoffworldly.com. You can go get information. We are a group of astronaut hopefuls. We are working together to prepare ourselves for spaceflight. We have quite a number of questions coming in now. So the first one is actually from Steve Wolf. I don't know if you want to come on, Steve, and ask it yourself, or if you want me to read it.
You could read it.
All right.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Do you believe that the U.S. government or any government, what can they do to make access to space more available to the average citizen?
Well, let me jump in there. I think U.S. government has done a huge amount, right? The FAA Office of Space Technology Transportation, I forget what it's called. The fact that they stepped up, I don't even want to say, is maybe 20 years ago, and started to craft legislation around private suborbital and orbital space flight, and created an infrastructure, a regulatory framework for how these programs would operate, gave the US a massive leg up over the rest of the world, and created an environment for investment that we're now starting to see pay off. Okay, it took way longer than everybody anticipated. Doesn't matter. It's happening. And so, the individuals who are involved in that original crafting of, just creating the impetus and the interest in setting those regulations was enormous. And I think, all of us who are operating in the industry today, have to look back and thank those individuals, because you can see other countries struggling with it. Now they're wondering, why are these launches happening in the US but not in their country? And it's very simple. It's because there's no regulatory framework. So how do you make a decision as an investor or as an entrepreneur to want to start to fly your vehicle from a country where you have no idea how it's going to be regulated, or if you're going to be allowed? You've got to clear that first hurdle.
I think we're very fortunate, particularly in the United States, to have the confluence of some other circumstances that make spaceflight easier here. One of them is the incredible work that the US government has put into spaceflight over the decades through NASA and other government agencies, but particularly NASA, from the development of technologies to the funding of some of the commercial crew efforts, to the training of people, ground controllers, flight directors, technicians and engineers and astronauts, who are now out in industry making these things a commercial reality. And I particularly have been privileged to be a part of both the government space program and now a commercial space program, taking the lessons I learned at NASA, lessons that were very well taught and very important, and applying those to commercial spaceflight to make it cheaper, more available, and safer. All these things come together to make this time in history, I think, a great time for the explosion of spaceflight we're seeing now.
Anything that any other governments can do to learn from what the United States has done? I mean, you're from England. Is there anything that England or any other country can do?
I think investing in space is important, and very important for the future of humanity. Government investment, private investment, commercial investment, all those things help open up space, and not just to people, but to industries, to commercial enterprises.
I know we are seeing ESA talk about getting human spaceflight started in European countries. I don't know how far that's going to get, but I'm hoping they are able to do it.
Ultimately, everybody will be involved in spaceflight, whether they're involved in it today or not.
Great. Nick, the next question is for you. Can you describe a typical day in space and how ordinary things are affected by zero-G to make things harder or easier? And Tom, I know that a whole middle chapter of my book is dedicated to things that you told me about preparing to, experience the ordinary things in space.
Well, I don't, it's hard to use the word typical for a day in space, both because it's an extraordinary experience and because every day is different. But you have to do a lot of things you have to do on Earth. You have to get up and you have to get dressed. In space, of course, getting up is easy. You float out of your sleeping bag or out of your crew quarters. Getting dressed is tricky. some of the simple things we take for granted here on Earth just don't work in space. For example, you may pick up clothing that you laid out the night before on Earth and put it on in the morning. In space, anything you lay out typically floats away unless you strap it down. So, and you float away while you're getting dressed. So those little things we do without thinking here on Earth are just more challenging in space. Eating breakfast, that's also more challenging. You have to typically eat one piece of your meal at a time because you only have two hands, one for holding the food and one for holding the utensil. And that's if you can anchor yourself to the floor of the spacecraft with your feet and foot straps, or perhaps if you've been in space for a few days, you're comfortable floating around. At the other end of the day, there's going to the bathroom. Much more challenging in space. You can't, for example, use a toilet that is cleverly designed for 1G with a bowl of water and a simple flushing mechanism that uses gravity. You have to use a much more complicated toilet, one that comes with a checklist and your crewmate's expectation that you absolutely will not break it. There is no plumber available. All these little things are more difficult. But between all of them, there's the opportunity to float through a module, float from one end to the other, to experience moving things in weightlessness. They still have inertia, but they don't have weight, and it's wonderful to play with things. And then there's the view. So every minute the view changes. And every time you pass a window, the temptation is there to stop and look and try and recognize what's on the earth below you. So every day is a bit different. Every day is wonderful, and it's not at all like being on Earth.
I hope to experience that someday. You said that beautifully. Tom, is there anything you want to add?
No, I will encourage people to read your book.
Thank you so much.
As will I.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. The next question comes from Brett. On the scale of nominal to awestruck, where do the majority of various astronaut perspectives fall? Mostly nominal, mostly awestruck, somewhere in the middle?
Awestruck. Towards the awestruck end of the spectrum, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Self-included, even after years of training.
Yeah, and I will echo the same thing from having polled our past clients. I would say exactly the same thing.
I'd be shocked if you hadn't. That sounds like a softball question that all of us need to experience. We really do. How do we get up there? And so I wanted to know what you think is the most common misperception about commercial human spaceflight. I know there's a lot of them out there. I know I continuously have to fight against the it's only billionaires in space kind of narrative. And so what are some of the misconceptions that you are seeing that you want to correct as we speak today?
So I will, let me jump in if you don't mind, Nick. I'll go first here. So I would say that we're in some kind of a billionaire space race. Right? That is a very lazy headline in my mind. Okay, yes, it's true. Some of the we're beneficiaries of the interest of some wealthy individuals, but what they're trying to do goes way beyond a space race. They really are trying to advance humanity's capability, and it's impacting in so many different ways in so many different industries. And it's just space tourism is the other one. It's not space tourism. Yes, these are non-professional individuals flying to space, and some are going or are motivated because they think it's going to be an interesting experience. But again, they're part of something that is much bigger than that. And I think, it's difficult for some of us, small companies, small individuals to try to retake some of that narrative that's being written by, journalists who are not necessarily scratching too deeply below the surface. But we need to try to find a way of restructuring that narrative and having people talk about it in a different way. And the other thing I'd say the misconception is, and it's related, is it's actually really hard, particularly orbital spaceflight. It's not easy. As I touched on before, there's all sorts of risks and uncertainties and challenges along the way. And so to call it tourism, I think is diminishing the effort that is put into by the private individuals who are engaging in this activity, that it actually takes an awful lot more than just packing a bag and showing up at the airport.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We are not in a race right now. We're in what will ultimately be a cooperative endeavor to put people and enterprises into space. So yes, not a space race in the way that it perhaps used to be. I think the biggest misconception we face at Blue Origin about space is that it requires a lot of training to be an astronaut, to go into space. I know I'd had years, as I've said, and when I got to Blue and was in charge of designing the initial draft to our astronaut training, I thought to myself, well, it probably is going to take about a week to train somebody for a suborbital spaceflight. And after thinking about it and iterating on the training for quite a while, we determined that it really wasn't. It was a matter of hours, certainly less than 2 days, to train somebody for this. And I think ultimately, as the design of spacecraft improves over the years, the training will get to be less and less of a burden, and people will see that it is actually something that almost anybody can do. So there's a misconception that we fix when people show up for training for a New Shepard flight. They rapidly learn that they too can do what's required to become an astronaut without an enormous amount of training.
It's interesting that you may be able to add to this as well. The other misconception I run into a lot is, why aren't they flying with a professional? You know, why is there no captain, no pilot, no commander, whatever, however you want to describe it? And, you know, people fairly quickly are able to change their perception on that, but they come in thinking that, you know, they need to be guided. And, you know, cargo spacecraft have been docking with space stations for decades. And if those, you know, they're carrying cargo, it's not, you know, as precious as a human, but they're still able to do it routinely and without any issues. So why do you suddenly need a pilot when people are involved? It's a curious psychological thing with us humans. It's the same with aircraft. Most of them don't need pilots to fly them, but we insist that there is one there. And so, yeah, that's a common misconception.
Yeah.
A minor one, but
it's true that you don't need a pilot on board a spacecraft these days because the trajectory management is largely automated during the flight. But it wasn't for every phase, for example, of shuttle flying. But when you fly as a private astronaut, for example, on New Shepard, you may not have a crew of people with you in the vehicle, but there is a dedicated and well-trained crew of people on the ground monitoring all the spacecraft systems and talking to you and helping make systems management and perhaps even trajectory decisions for you. So the people may not be in the spacecraft controlling it, but there are many of them on the ground supporting spaceflight and helping make sure that it's safe, effective, and enjoyable for the people on board.
That is great. I know that Axiom, for example, has said that even though they have Michael Lopez Alegria, a very experienced NASA astronaut, on board their first Axiom 1 flight as commander, they have said that about Axiom 4 is when they're planning for no experienced astronaut to join the private crew. So it is going to be interesting to see how this evolves, whether or not it becomes all automated like Blue Origin is with New Shepard, or whether we continue to have a commander of a mission or whatever we call it. Curious to see how that evolves over time. And
so much that everything is completely automated. There'll still be room for decision making on the ground.
Sure.
To handle, say, minor malfunctions, to make decisions about when is the right time to come home. If somebody has a medical problem, for example, that'll never be automated. It just, I think, won't be necessarily done by people on the vehicle. The people with the expertise will be on the ground, where they potentially have a lot more information resources at their disposal. And when they're not taking up one of these valuable seats, repeatedly flying to space to help make decisions that can be made from the ground. As so many decisions were even on the shuttle, by the way. The shuttle program and the space station program have a long history of having an extensive flight control team on the ground, flight controllers, flight directors, flight surgeons, who are responsible for a lot more of the decisions about spaceflight than I think people really appreciate. So there's another misconception to talk. It's that astronauts make all the decisions. Even in historical space programs, they really don't.
You speak from personal experience there.
I've seen both sides of that coin now. As a former astronaut and now as a launch director, we call it flight director, I've come to appreciate just how difficult it is to learn all the things you need to learn to be in the position to make the right decisions on launch day and during a mission. It's a fun challenge. I had no idea what an interesting challenge it was.
We're getting close to the end of the program, but as a scientist, I am biased. So I'd love to hear how you feel about conducting science, both orbital science projects. I know that the missions that have gone up, a lot of the private astronauts have decided to take up scientific experiments onto the International Space Station and dedicate a lot of their time that they could be spending staring out the window to doing science, and even suborbital. So we had the first human-tended suborbital science experiment on Virgin Galactic last year. So how are you feeling about these science missions, and how do they integrate into the preparation and the experience that the private astronaut can undertake?
Tom, do you want to go first, or shall I take it?
Happily, sure. So I think it's great. Whichever way around you look at it. I mean, it's long been argued that there is the part of the market for spaceflight includes researchers who are funded by non-government organizations, so private research organizations in some way, shape, or form. Now, where prices are right now, that's a pretty expensive undertaking, and I can't talk to the cost-benefit assessment for the sponsoring organization, but I'm sure we will see it soon. And Nick may have more information on that I don't have access to. So, but what I think is more readily obvious is private astronauts are eminently trainable, and Nick was selected as a professional astronaut, I'm sure in large part because he was also extremely trainable. Right, he didn't come in with a lot of the skills that were required, and for some of the research that I'm sure he was asked to do, he received the training on the ground before he went, and then he followed through his checklist and completed that work. There's no reason a lot of these private astronauts can't do the same thing if they're prepared to give up some of their time in preparation and some of their time on orbit. And so I think that's a very realistic set of expectations, and I would advise any private astronaut considering it to budget a little bit of your time to give to some of these research organizations. I think it's a very important part of the future of any private astronaut program, is to be able to incorporate that research. So whether it's matching research with private astronauts, or hopefully one day, yes, there will be a market for fully funded researchers to be able to go to space. I think that's absolutely should be encouraged.
Yep, the history of scientific experiments in spaceflight is a rich one, and I think the future will be even richer. And Tom's right; it's the people you send up. They are very trainable, and they can do all sorts of different things. They bring their passions with them. People will be flying astronauts in the future with different backgrounds and different passions, a broader set of backgrounds and passions than the historical astronauts have brought to spaceflight. And of course, people are very flexible. So it's a great idea to fly people to do science. One day we won't just have the technical aspects of doing the science in space. We'll have the actual scientists coming up with experiments, designing and building them in space. But the thing I get really excited about is this science is a precursor to industry in space. It's either life science, about keeping people in space healthy and happy for longer periods of time, or it's science to do with things like manufacturing, 3D printing, material science in space. And all those things are precursors to off-planet industry, which I think is when spaceflight as a major driver of the world's economies will really take off. We will be doing more payload flights on New Shepard. We've done several in the recent past. They've been exciting. They've carried everything from life science research to art into space. And we'll be doing more of those in the near future. And we'll be doing those on New Glenn and on the Orbital Reef as well.
I'd love to see it. I know that one of the projects I worked on in grad school flew on Blue Origin, so I'd love to fly with it next time.
Extended payloads will be a thing in the near future for us as well. So I look forward to that.
Very, very excited to see that. We did have a question come in about buyer's remorse. Don't name names, but even though there's a small sample size right now, have you seen any clients admit to buyer's remorse?
No, quite the. I mean, not even a hint of it. Quite the opposite. Everybody comes back and says that they had a wonderful time in a collegial and enjoyment sense, and that it was a life-changing experience and something they can't wait to communicate to all of the people they meet. So, no, I've never even thought of the term buyer's remorse in connection to spaceflight until you just mentioned it.
Yeah, I can echo that. I think hand on heart, I can say I haven't had, any negative feedback from clients who've been through the experience to say that it was not worth every ounce of blood, sweat, and tears that they had to go through to get it, for sure.
I can't imagine it would be for me either. So again, I'm here. I can do science. I'm trainable. We are running.
You can really communicate well, Laura, which is another benefit. So,
indeed, yeah.
Great people in spaceflight.
Yeah.
Each person, I believe, has their own means of communication, whether that is written words, speaking, art. I love to see the artists fly. I'm really looking forward to more art in space. Happy to see it. So that's the reason why we fly so many different types of people, is to express things in their own unique ways. So I do want to ask you what potential you see growing from here. This is different from the earlier question I asked about, where do you see it evolving? I want to know about the potential that you see. We already talked about millions of people living and working in space, but what does that mean? What's the potential for human spaceflight, and what's the potential for humanity?
I'll be honest, I'm not very good at this question. I'm too much of a realist. I look too much at the next sort of 2 to 3 years as what is it we need to do now in order to build towards this this future. I think it's important for humanity to develop the skills to be able to exist beyond our atmosphere, and I think it's important that we're doing this work, but yeah, I'm not very good at projecting too far into the future.
I would phrase the question the other way around. I'd say, what isn't in the future of spaceflight? If you want inspiration, I'd say read the incredible collection of works of science fiction that have been published over the last, I was going to say 100 years, but it's really longer than that. Works by Heinlein and Asimov and Clarke. They were my favorites, David Brin. But there are many others. And they all give you a slightly different idea of what the future might contain. But really, I think there are no limits. Ultimately, humans will do everything in space that they currently do on Earth, and things we can imagine that we don't do on Earth, and things we cannot yet imagine. And that's the beauty of moving people into space, is people will find interesting new things to do that we haven't imagined yet. I'm looking forward to seeing some of it in my lifetime.
Yeah, I think being a little more practical and looking in the next few years, I think we are going to start to see, I don't know if it's the next 5-10 years, we're going to start to see sports in space. We're going to start to see movies being shot in space. We're going to see private individuals go out and do spacewalks. We're going to see media projects where individuals get to fly to space. We're going to see more artists fly. I think it's just, opening up the world of possibilities. I think going back to what Nick said earlier about accessibility, individuals with disabilities, I think we're going to start to see, projects like that showing what is possible. Because, ultimately in space, you're almost more free than you are here. So individuals with disabilities are less disabled in space, if that's an appropriate thing to say. So yeah, I think we're just at the very, very start of what's possible, and it's taken a long time to get here. I was reading an article just the other day. There was a drug that is currently undergoing clinical trials, phase 2 clinical trials, that was the result of a protein crystal growth experiment conducted on the space station, I think in 2003 or 2004. So now things are starting to come to market as a result of that very early research. And I think it's just going to be, examples like that are going to get more and more common over the next few years as we see the result of all of this effort. And similarly, I think the last couple of years have seen a very high percentage of the actual science work that's ever been done on the space station has been done in the last couple of years, since they got away from just maintaining station to actually being able to have the crew time to be able to do the science work. So I think, we can't even imagine, I think, at this point, what we may be able to see in the next few years.
Yes, and we know we've had 2 movies in space, right? Apogee of Fear,
Yes,
Richard
very
Gere
much
again,
one.
and also The Challenge that was filmed by a Russian crew last year.
Mhm.
So looking forward to those movie studios in space. I know there's mixed martial arts studios that are planned, greenhouses. There's all kinds of interesting ideas, and we'll just have to see where the funding comes in and things come to fruition. Looking forward to all the different possibilities. So I wanted to give you both the last minute, whatever it is you want to say to wrap up, any last minute thoughts that you might have on this topic.
That's your most difficult question yet, Laura. It requires us to really think outside the box here. I guess I'd wrap up by saying access to space for everybody is in our future. And while it has taken us a while to get here, the pace is really picking up. The growth, I think, is exponential. Last year, we had the most people fly to space, I think, of any year in human history. And we also had the most people in space simultaneously. I think it was 19 last year. And while that seems like a small number compared to the hundreds, thousands, or millions we would all like ultimately see in space, it is a part of that exponential growth curve. So stay tuned, get involved, fly in space if it's within your means currently, and if it's not, hold on a bit, and it will be one day. So stay tuned, get involved.
Yeah, I think I echo that absolutely, 100%. That if you don't have the means today, stay patient. We'll get there in the end. And there are different ways that you can get involved and support, this ongoing activity. There are so many organizations now that are involved in private astronaut spaceflight in one way or another, whether it's a non-profit advocacy group or if it's a company that's actually making it happen, like the 2 that are represented here. There are so many different ways, and we appreciate all the support and all the encouragement and all of the interest, and I think it's a very exciting future that we have ahead of us.
And if I could add, even if you don't want to fly in space, there are still many interesting, challenging, and useful ways to get involved. Become an engineer, become a scientist, get involved in a government program or one of the many private companies. There's a lot to do that's just as interesting as actually flying in space, as I've learned since I left NASA. There's an awful lot to do that's really fascinating and very valuable. So come join us at Blue Origin or anywhere else in the industry. We would love to have you come and work on spaceflight with us.
Yeah, and similarly for the more mundane skills like marketing and sales, now's the time to get involved in the industry as well. It's not just about engineers designing stuff. It's we've got to get out there and communicate about it too. So thank you, Laura.
I was just thinking that same thing. We need a whole diversity of skill sets. So the marketing, along with the engineering, along with art and communications that we talked about in so many different fields. Thank you both so much for your time. It has been wonderful to speak with both of you. I've really appreciated it. I appreciate your insights today and your insights in my book. And thank you again. And then if you're at all interested about space policy, how we go forward on a side of making sure that we can get spaceflight regulated or freely available to more and more people. I know that we've got a learning period that's going to be expiring next year probably, so stay tuned for that. Love to hear from you at Beyond Earth Institute, so please get in touch with Steve Wolf and anyone else at the Institute. Steve, you said to invite you back in. I'm inviting you back in. I don't know if you meant verbally or I have to do something.
That's it. No, that's it. Oh, I just wanted to say before you guys all drop off, again, really appreciate fantastic conversation. Really got into a lot of issues, a lot of topics that are really near and dear to my heart. Talking about Frank White's overview effect, talking about and Frank's a good friend of mine as well for many, many years, talking about the misconceptions. And it's was nicely tied into what I was getting at the top of the program, where folks are just questioning this whole thing about where we're going in space, where humanity is going. I really appreciated Tom and Nick your comments that we're trying to just do this one step at a time, right? So right now we're in a particular phase where we're we're sending people up 4 at a time aboard the Blue Origin, New Shepard, a few on, and you could actually almost begin to see the beginning of a Moore's law, right? With the number of people going into space. And you could see that it's going to gradually increase. And then, but over time, 10, 20 years, you're going to start to see that bend in the hockey stick where, human occupation for living and working and doing all kinds of things in space are going to be possible. Of course, we don't know what that future exactly is going to look like, but we know that future is coming, right? And we know that there are people that are determined to make that future happen, right? So those are the things that we do know. And to the extent that the Beyond Earth Institute and other organizations can help to influence public policy in such a way that can bring about that future quicker than it might otherwise occur, that's really the role that we want to be playing. So I really, and Laura, of course, you did an excellent job. Your book is great. Hopefully everyone will read that. This post will be, this event will be posted. So you can look for that and we'll share that with you. And hopefully you'll share that within your community. I do have to ask you, Dr. Nick, though, you're helping to get all these other people into space for Blue Origin. Come on, they're sending up Blue Origin staffers. When's your turn?
I would have happily gone on any of those flights, but I was a flight director for both of them, helping launch them. So as soon as I'm not the flight director anymore for any missions, I'll be putting my name in the hat to go up as a Blue Origin employee.
That's great. And Tom, thank you so much. And so I think with that, I'll let you guys go. I'll just wrap this up here. I want to again thank Laura, Tom, and Dr. Nick. But I also want to thank some of the folks behind the scenes: Brett Jones, Arnie Christensen, Lindsay Rogers, Tyler Bender. It kind of takes a team to put this together, and it's been and so we really appreciate that effort. Again, we look forward to seeing your participation going forward. Contact us at beyondearth.org if you are interested in what we're doing and would like to be part of this. We're eager to hear from anyone. So with that, thank you all. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.